We have the bio on the website and in Hoover, but I'm just going to mention a couple things that are not there. I've just had the privilege of meeting our speaker, Orobator, yesterday. Some of you know him, have known him for many years. Orobator comes originally from Nigeria, but spent 20 years in Kenya, and now has been dean at Santa Clara for the last 3 years? 3 years. All right. And we have, here's a summary of the topic, but more importantly, let's welcome him to listen to what he has to bring to us today.
Against a widely held belief and documentary evidence of decline, it may seem hubristically fantastic to claim that Christianity in the West is enjoying its peak moment of maturity, akin to the phase of generativity characteristic of adult development. Yet, this is the line of inquiry that constitutes the central theme of Czech philosopher and theologian Thomas Halík in his fairly recent book titled The Afternoon of Christianity, The Courage to Change, which incidentally was published in South Bend. Halík believes that the crisis eclipsing the religious fortunes of the West serves as a kairos, a catalyst for renewal, revival, and resurgence of Christianity, provided propitious conditions are maintained and appropriate tasks assumed. Slightly exaggerated in my opinion, Halík does not, however, dabble in fantasy. He challenges theology and his church to think more expansively, albeit optimistically, about the possibilities of reorienting the historical arch of Christianity in the West, which by most accounts bends downward, not upward. Thomas Halík, conducts his discourse unapologetically within the confines of Western Christianity in a manner that might lead the uninformed reader to perceive Christianity as an exclusively Western asset, even if redolent of a defunct Christendom. Halík's interlocutors are mostly the usual suspects of magisterial thinkers who anchor Western Christianity's theoretical, speculative, and analytical intellectual discourses. In my estimation, this tightly circumscribed, and I would add, tightly controlled account and vision of Christianity misses the larger 21st century narrative of the reshaping of mission in the global context. And at the core of this 21st century narratives lies the phenomenal shift of Christianity's center of gravity to the global south. And of this seismic shift, science, evidence, and data abound. Speaking of the context of which I am most familiar, namely Africa, Pope Benedict XVI eulogized Africa's spiritual and religious potential as, quote, an immense spiritual lung for a humanity that seems to be in a crisis of faith and hope, end quote. Now, when Benedict spoke, Pope Benedict, that is, spoke about Africa as the lung of humanity, he was extolling the prosperity of religion, notably Christianity, on the continent. As many experts have asserted, the future of world Christianity passes through Africa. Statistics don't lie. Not only is sub-Saharan Africa clearly amongst the most religious places in the world, according to one estimate, 1 in 5 of all the Christians in the world today now lives in sub-Saharan Africa. We must, however, exercise caution about measuring growth and progress in the global south by merely counting bodies and churches. From a theological or sociological perspective, there is a paradox I see in the fact that the growth in religious affiliation and the proliferation of churches in the global south is happening amidst widespread poverty, wealth inequality, violence, underdevelopment, and persistent social dysfunctionality. How then are we to square the paradox of socioeconomic and political distress with ecclesial and religious progress? Ugandan theologian Emmanuel Katongole has written that, quote, churches and coffins are the two most prevalent images associated with Africa today, end quote. So the situation raises a few questions. To what extent does this resurgent Christianity, thriving as it is, empower people and communities in the two-third worlds to confront their multiple individual and collective existential and challenges and struggles? Is Christianity still a force for good? Or does it simply exploit the vulnerability of an already broken and dehumanized people with utopian and false promises of prosperity? Now, we may not, as I believe a colleague mentioned earlier in the morning, we may not romanticize the phenomenon of religious growth in the global south. As I say it, what seems to defy logic and require explanation is the astronomical scale of the growth of churches and various religious groups in the face of escalating social, political, economic collapse and dysfunctionality. So, from a global perspective, therefore, it is no longer enough to celebrate the growth or even lament the decline of Christianity as curious phenomena distributed in discrete geographical spaces. So it is not the rest versus the West. I propose that we situate this phenomenon of the dynamic between the West and the rest in a global context by renewing our understanding of the dynamics in order to deepen our understanding of how the rest continuously influences and shapes the fate and fortune of the West. This approach, I believe, allows us to create a wholesome vision of Christian citizenship in God's household that Paul celebrates in Ephesians 2:19-22. So I propose for your consideration the notion of missionary dispersion, to underscore the fact that the dramatic growth of Christianity in the global south offers pathways for the renewal and regeneration of Christianity in the global north, in less sophisticated ways that would seem to elude the theoretical constructs of scholars like Thomas Halleck. What I call missionary dispersion is similar to the biological processes by which seeds, we've heard a bit about seeds today, by which seeds are disseminated, germinate, and grow in uncharacteristic patterns with the ultimate aim of ensuring the sustainability, not of the seed itself, but of the entire species. As Christianity's center of gravity has shifted southward, the resulting phenomenal growth has contributed to its renewal in the north. How so, you might wonder? For me, then, the dispersion, the missionary dispersion, is a vital condition of possibility of the renewal and resurgence of Christianity in the West. I would mention now two trends which I believe help us to illustrate this pattern of missionary dispersion. The first is what some have termed reverse evangelization. In the Roman Catholic tradition, for example, more and more local churches are creating relationships, partnerships, collaborations with other overseas dioceses to ensure a steady supply of religious personnel from those communities, or for those communities rather, that experience persistent and acute shortfalls. As missionaries from the global south increase steadily in the West, so does the influence of the former over the latter expand, thus offering the possibility of a new form of evangelization of the global north. Speaking, for example, of African Christianity, studies and anecdotal evidence confirm that Africa has become an essential supplier of human capital in far-flung locations of Western Christianity. Of the estimated 455,000 Christian missionaries worldwide, 30% are Catholic, of which a significant proportion are Africans. A subset of this category function as bivocational evangelizers. That is, economic migrants who evangelize, including by setting up churches in their spare time. A second related trend, then, is migration. Across several European countries and the US, human mobility is a marker, or has become a marker, of sometimes fraught exchanges between the West and the rest. A simplistic approach considers this a unidirectional flow from the rest to the West. This approach, however, lacks the benefit of historical awareness of the colonial project that settled European adventurers, traders, fortune seekers, missionaries, mercenaries in overseas enclaves, protectorates, and colonies. While often instrumentalized and exploited by extreme nationalists and mainstream political groups alike for political gain, the effect of migration is consequently presented as a security and/or cultural threat to our way of life. I maintain that it also has to do with faith, religion, and the spread of the gospel. You see, when people move, they do not leave their faith behind. People who make religion a part of their lives do not easily shed its cloak while engaged in the often perilous search for a better future in the West. On the contrary, many rely actively on the resources of their religious faith to sustain them through this passage and beyond. Whether or not they integrate with existing communities of faith or seek out kindred or like-minded adherents to recreate familiar patterns of faith, life, belief, and worship, the presence of such adherents has a transformative impact on local Christian communities. As Pope Francis of blessed memory once asserted, and President Ruth Padilla de Bust reminded us yesterday, the experience of uprootment, migration, and displacement can be a source of blessings for the spiritual condition of host communities. Currently, Christian diaspora communities from the global south are remaking significant expanses of communities in the West. Examples abound in the west of the US and in Western Europe, of how immigrant communities are remaking the identity of Christianity and redrawing the map of global Christianity that more closely integrates now the rest and the West. Take one example that I've been personally involved in through the Jesuit project. In the United Kingdom, London hosts the largest population of diaspora Christians of African descent. And 28% of Christians who regularly attend services are from African diaspora communities. Compare that to 13% of the general population. In inner city communities, attendance can be as high as 50%. Most of the churchgoers attend Pentecostal, evangelical, and African Institutist churches. The Roman Catholic Church has established several chaplaincies to serve the pastoral needs of ethnic communities from various African countries, including Ghana, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Zambia. Several recent immigrants whose needs include sacramental services, social and economic and cultural support form part of these communities. So there are interesting features of the foregoing point, two points that I just made, and I would like to just zero in on them. First, as we know, in the West, it is customary for the distinctions of religious proclivities to harden into unbreachable binaries: traditionalist versus progressives, conservative versus liberal, right versus left. Inherent in this demarcation or polarization is the phenomenon of culture wars. Interestingly, this positionality is incongruent with the religious sensibilities of Christians from the global South, who are less amenable to such rigid ideological taxonomy and who maintain a certain fluidity in their positionality on ethical and social questions. I would argue that the practiced tendency to categorize Christians in the global South along the axis of conservatism is at best exaggerated and at worst a mischaracterization of the positional variety that exists among communities of faith, belief, and worship in the global South in matters of doctrine and other issues of gender, liturgy, sexual morality, etc. A second thing I would note is the reconfiguration of the religious landscape in the West does not rely solely on the settlement of new diaspora Christian communities. Something else is happening internally, organically, propelled by a variety of local factors. A recent increase in the number of church-going or faith-seeking adherents in the US and in Europe has been interpreted as evidence of religious renaissance. Social, popular, and mainstream media abound with theories and narratives that attempt to explain and illustrate this trend. A new Gallup survey reports a sharp increase in the number of men in the US under 30 who say religion is very important in their lives. The number jumped to 42% in 2005, up from 28% in 2003. And I just wonder, when these surveys wax eloquently about these trends, does anybody ever think that the Holy Spirit might be at work again? For the moment, at least, the claim of a wholesale comeback of Christianity is unsupported by hard data. It seems that what can be concluded from this trend is that Christianity is losing members at a much slower pace. Lauren Jackson, the editor of the New York Times newsletter Believing, about how people live their faith today, puts this trend in perspective. And she writes, quote, "But just because people have stopped leaving church en masse, that doesn't mean a revival is underway, that suddenly the country is rushing back to the pews. Religious change doesn't happen that quickly, end quote. My third and final observation. Perhaps the most pertinent aspect of the dispersion of Christianity in the global South to the benefit of the global North is the refashioning of the theological landscape of global Christianity. For centuries, Christianity enjoyed a settled state in the West, acquiring, in particular instances, the status of an established religion. As such, a certain compatibility of purposes ensued, ensuring that the concerns of the dominant socioeconomic, cultural, and political groups were either baptized by Christianity or imbibed by the dominant theological narratives. In the face of this phenomenon, the theologies of the global South have been astonishingly successful in expanding the theological vision of global Christianity and refocusing it on issues as paramount and pertinent as socioeconomic inequality, interfaith encounters, social justice, ecological justice, humanism, and the enculturation of the gospel. Each of these domains of theological inquiry has yielded rich resources for the knowledge, understanding, and practice of Christianity in a global context. Pope Francis, again, excelled in his singular ability to identify the gifts of the churches of the peripheries for the perceived center. A church, he said, that looks towards the needs of the geographical and existential peripheries. And that was a cherished staple of his teaching as Pope. Yet, if the aim, as Pope Francis saw it, was the exchange of gifts between the center and the periphery, the reality, unfortunately, suggested something different. That is mostly a centrifugal movement, always from the center to the margins. A different pattern is possible, and experience bears us out on this. I recall the poem, The Second Coming, by the Irish poet W.B. Yeats. Things fall apart. The center can no longer hold. He wrote, the exhausted center of Western Christianity no longer suffices to define the totality of global Christianity. As I see it, rather than focusing on how the West can reach out, notice, or accommodate the needs of the rest, the current configuration of global Christianity can be more effectively viewed as what I call a constellation of peripheries. There is no longer an absolute center. This dynamic framework is less centered on or dominated by one geopolitical bloc. Rather, it comprises varieties of geographical and existential spaces. This could be whole churches, could be communities, where each geography has something to contribute, but neither dominates nor defines the sum of the whole. In my opinion, such a vision more accurately represents the current configuration of global Christianity. But I would add, in extolling the virtues of religious flourishing in the global South, we may not overlook some obvious gaps, contradictions, and paradoxes. In addition to some that I've previously mentioned, I would add the following. In a globalized and highly networked world, the global South faces a reckoning regarding its own ability or lack, therefore, to grapple with emerging trends ailing the North. Emerging questions will need answers, like fragmentation of communities, isolation of individuals, growing social and political instability, and technological changes in the age of artificial intelligence, and new media which are reshaping at a dizzying pace, not only the ways of believing, behaving, and belonging, particularly among younger generations, but what it means to be human, and by extension, what it means to be a Christian in the 21st century. At an age when Christian communities and churches in American and European heartlands struggle to reclaim, revitalize, and refashion their erstwhile secure Christian identity and assert their relevance, the rest of global Christianity contends with how to manage religious vitality, growth, and dynamism. It may be unrealistic to fix a time stamp on the distinctive trajectories of both histories, dawn, afternoon, sunset, for the fate of both are conjoined in the evangelizing mission of global Christianity. So those like Thomas Halleck, who argue vociferously for the conditions of possibility of transformation and resurgence of Christian faith, ought first to understand that such a reversal of fortune does not occur by force of a one-sided intellectual maneuvering, no matter how astute or rigorous. And second, that the dispersion and migratory flows of Christian communities are already catalyzing and concretizing this transformation, catalyzing this resurgence. The inevitable enrichment of the West by the rest will unfold and flourish, not in isolation of mutually assured superiority, but in the mutuality and tension, complementarity and difference that shape the present context of religious belief, faith, and worship globally. To borrow an insight from Stephen Bevans, this dynamic of mutuality and complementarity between the West and the rest, or the rest and the West, in fact aligns with and illustrates how God works in mission. How? In dialogue and partnership, without predetermining the outcome, always open to risks, always open to vulnerability. And that is our story. Thank you.
So, to respond to Orobator's address, we have some input from a person who was going to be with us and will be with us via video. That is Ellen Sherby, who is just stepping off the board of directors. She is the manager of the International Global Ecumenical Liaisons of the Presbyterian Church in USA, and the Presbyterian Life and Witness Agency. She served for many years in Nicaragua and also currently accompanies her husband in work with migrants in Mid-Kentucky Presbytery. So with us now, Ellen Sherby.
Good afternoon, American Society of Missiology friends and colleagues. I'm glad to be with you, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to bring a response to Dean Orobator's very interesting and insightful paper. Dean Orobator's presentation reminds us in fresh and compelling ways that the fate of global Christianity is conjoined among all Christians of the world. More than a rest to the West dynamic, Orobator suggests that global Christianity might be shaped into a new pattern, a garden of plants spread and flourishing from the seeds of what he calls missionary dispersion, from everyone and everywhere, to everyone and everywhere. Or another compelling image from his paper, a constellation of peripheries where there is no center and no margin. Dr. Harvey Kwiyani, a Malawian theologian leading the Center for Global Witness and Human Migration of the Church Mission Society in Oxford, poses important questions about the concept of multiple centers of mission in a publication of the United Evangelical Mission called Mission Still On? Why We Need Post-Colonial Perspectives. Kwiyani asks, whose centers are these? What makes them centers? What happens at those centers? And if there are centers, there must be margins. His approach to mission is similar to Dean Orobator's in that he hopes that the nature of mission will be, quote, decentered and decentralized and democratized. And he also states, we cannot effectively talk about mission in a post-colonial world while replicating colonial structures in other parts of the world, end quote. So if many aspects of mission from the West to the rest have been or are colonial or hold any colonial residue, Kwiyani is suggesting that if care is not taken, a mission pattern from the rest to the West could end up being colonial in nature as well. In this constellation of peripheries and missionary dispersion model proposed by Dean Orobator, no one is centered. No one community, nation, people, denomination, or mission agency dominates or is the sender or primary agent of mission. Where is this kind of de-centered mission model already functioning, and what does that look like? Well, I'm sure there are many church bodies and church councils around the world that do embody this kind of model. Some of you are probably thinking of some examples as you consider this. And yet it seems that Dean Orobator is inviting us to consider a more organic kind of mission, arising naturally through relationships, particularly relationships between peoples of the world in relation to and with people living in Western Christian nations. And here arises one fundamental question for us to wrestle with. It's one I'll come back to in greater depth at the end. What is needed to cultivate a decentered and multi-centered, organic, intercultural, and global mission community, particularly in what we consider Western nations? In light of this decentering of mission, Orobator highlights the ongoing opportunity for the, quote, refashioning of the theological landscape of global Christianity, end quote. Kwiyani speaks to this as well, agreeing with Orobator that Christianity in the West is on the decline, and that most Christians live outside of the West. Kwiyani also writes pointedly and critically that theology from the global South is only perceived as exotic raw material for people in the North. And he writes, between the West and the rest of the world, there is only a dialogue of the deaf. I think it's important for us to receive those criticisms, but also note that looking forward, like Orobator, Kwiyani suggests that the theological landscape can be reshaped through a, quote, conscious, cross-cultural theological dialogue between Christians of different cultural backgrounds, end quote. There is a kind of Honduran corn that my family plants in our yard every year in Louisville, Kentucky. It comes from seed that my husband brought some years ago from his family's home in Honduras to Louisville, and it's called maicito, which in Spanish means little corn. Now, in northern Honduras, it grows spindly and weak, doesn't grow very tall, it's very easily bent by the wind. And when the corn stalks grow, it only produces maybe 1 or 2 ears of corn per plant. Whereas in Louisville, maicito grows very sturdy and strong with a thick stalk. It grows impressively tall, reaching as high as our one-story house, the vision of which literally stops curious passersby in their tracks during the summer. So in Kentucky, maicito grows even as many as 4, sometimes 5 ears on one plant. What lessons can this Honduran corn grown in Kentucky bring us about mission, about the seeds of missionary dispersion and global Christianity? One takeaway could be that planting seeds of Christianity from global South or majority world peoples among Western or global North peoples could bear good fruits. After all, in the global North, the garden of Christian faith in many congregations of many denominations is often tilled and planted in the same way year after year. Could new varieties of Christian faith from the global South find fertile ground in the often tired and eroded soil of the global North? It's worth noting here that my husband says maicito grows best in soil that is not overly fertile. And if we follow the principles of permaculture, it's critical to point out that growth might only occur if old plants are cut down and left fallow to fertilize the ground. Well, to avoid continuing down this rabbit hole of comparing mission movements with agricultural methods, a more basic lesson from maicito corn could be that we can and should bloom wherever we are planted, and that when we are in conditions and contexts that are very different from what we're most used to, surprising growth can happen in us and under the right conditions and circumstances among the people and communities with whom we come into relationship. With all this in mind, and particularly considering the organic mission movements that seem to be named by Dean Orobator, I want to offer us a few closing questions. First of all, how might the seeds of intercultural mission be sown from the voices and lives of Christian peoples moving from global South, majority world nations into increasingly secularized Western nations? What would the conditions and relationships and connections look like to become kind of a fertile soil and lend themselves to deeper growth? Secondly, how is God calling us into God's mission today? Goddard Oblo promotes a post-colonial reading of Matthew 28:16 through 20. In the same text I mentioned earlier, mission still on. Through careful exegesis, Oblau suggests that while we often translate Matthew 28:19 to mean go and make disciples of all the nations, that in fact Jesus is urging the disciples to invite others into their learning community. Christ is present wherever we go, and the disciples are learners, not master teachers. Oblau writes, "It is not about bringing Jesus to strangers, but about discovering Jesus with them and among them. Jesus' invitation is for all people to be in learning community with others, in intercultural communities." This reading of Matthew 28 fits with Dean Orobator's invitation for us to embrace a constellation of peripheries. Third, for us, those of us who are from the West, especially who are of European descent, are we ready to relate with people from around the world who are already in our midst, or those who are arriving and want to be in a learning community of mission with us? And this goes deeper than a white congregation sharing their sanctuary with a Sudanese Christian fellowship or a Taiwanese congregation. It's good to share church buildings with one another, but what would a closer relationship look like between a so-called nesting and hosting communities or congregations if both were open to that? Finally, in this already and not yet way of being in mission, what is needed to prepare and equip people to be in service to one another, especially with and to communities that are different from them? What's the role of seminaries, denominational bodies at every level, and agencies in this work with and among a constellation of peripheries? How do we resource and come alongside each other in organic and decentered ways of being in community and intercultural mission? What tools, approaches, and skills are needed for preparing? And who should do the preparing? Who controls and manages the going, the sending, the receiving? Or is it all about releasing control and management? Dean Orobator offers us a compelling vision to break through old ways of being church and being Christian, starting with that natural missionary movement that's already happening of the rest to the West, and then moving us beyond these binaries. He invites us to transcend the us to them model and to come together as learning communities wherever we find ourselves. There is a great opportunity and so much for us to explore what this will mean for the work of seminaries, congregations, middle governing bodies, and church agencies. Let's get to work. Thank you.